Hello, I'm Dale Matchak, Chairman of the Econ program at Northwood University. Welcome to our Freedom Seminar. Our next guest is a man of many hats, literally, a man of many hats. And I'll have to keep his biography short because there's a long list of accomplishments here to talk about. Jimmy Greene is CEO and President of the Association of Builders and Contractors of Michigan, an organization that advocates for, educates, and trains over 350 builders and contractors, and is the former public policy regional representative for the National Federation of Independent Business. He's a serial entrepreneur. He founded Total Solutions Group in Saginaw, which specialized in telecom and technology project consulting. I'm Next, an online athletic apparel company, and the Saginaw Valley African American Leadership Training Institute. He's been involved in numerous civic and charity organizations. He's a graduate of Michigan's political leadership program, Leadership of Saginaw County, Great Lakes Bay Regional Leadership, and president of the board of directors of the International Academy of Saginaw, which is a charter school that he helped open, the Rockefeller Republican Center for Public Policy, and the Henry Marsh Institute for Public Policy. He was recognized by the Saginaw County Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors for his community involvement with the Spirit of Saginaw Award in 2007. So he is here to share with you, I think, an inspirational story about the American dream, his personal version of it. Please welcome Jimmy Greene.
Wow, thank you, Dale. And I'm so glad you cut that those accolades short. But in a way, sometimes I will actually have people read the entire thing, depending on our length of time or what the nature of it is. And I'm so pleased and so humbled by the accolades and some of the things I've achieved in my life. But I didn't get on here to talk about those things. I really got on here to talk about why those things are there. And I think that's the important piece of this too. I'm more apt to be comfortable in front of a crowd of people. I love walking a stage and interacting with folks and kind of looking in their faces. So I can almost see people like me. And when I say like me, that has nothing to do with color or gender. But sometimes you can just see people through their eyes. You can see their journeys. You can see their trials and tribulations. And I love doing that kind of stuff because, the things we do aren't necessarily the things we are. And I think that's a really important distinction going into, my presentation. And when Dale gave me kind of an idea about what he wanted me to talk about, it's kind of easy, only because of the transparency that I've had in my life. And I thought it was an important piece to convey to your students in particular, or your listeners and that audience that's out there. But the title of my presentation is a little bit odd, kind of catches people off guard. And I will tell you this, I sometimes before I speak, I almost have to apologize because I'm a freelancer and I will go places and go back and forth. And people who want to run my PowerPoint, they give up after that first time. They're like, we're not doing this again. And I'm glad of that because, that's what life is too. Life is it's not black and white and it's not straight and narrow. It is all over the place. And I think because of the way I was born and the climate, the culture, the environment that I was born into, I look back now and I think, as dire or as bad as it was when I grew up, I think those were the things that became a beta for me. They became the things that became tests for me, strengths for me, quite frankly. And so now I look back on how I was born and I think to myself, thank God. And that's the title of my presentation. I was born into trash, but my life has become a treasure. And then what's become the byproduct of that, quite frankly, are all the accolades that Dale mentioned earlier. And those will go on as I go through the presentation. But I started something as a byproduct of this too, because I think the legacy that we all want to leave behind is you do want to leave the world, no matter how you came into it, you want to leave it better than you found it. If I died tomorrow, and God, I hope my time isn't up then, but if I died tomorrow, I would have felt that I left behind treasure. and that'll be the end of my presentation. So I've kind of give you an idea about where I'm going in this, what I've done, but more importantly, where I've come from, because I think that's an important distinction as well, too. And maybe there's some people on here, and like I said, when I can look in your eyes, I can tell those folks who may have come from certain circumstances beyond their control and have had to navigate through this place in life. And if I don't do anything else, I just want to be able to demonstrate to you that all things really are possible. The greatest country in the world, despite our hiccups and our failures and all the things that we've heard through this pandemic and before that, and racial strife and gender issues and political upheavals and insurrections, you name it. God, I mean, what a great country to be in, that we can sit here on a Sunday and have this kind of conversation about the police bamming, knocking down our doors, or we can be critical and not be thrown into prison. So it's an amazing country. I think sometimes we take for granted. So one caution too, I will cough. So years ago, I'm celebrating my 21st year of being cancer free. So when I cough, it's not because I had corona, and I am vaccinated, mind you, and I encourage you to do it, but I don't mandate it. So that's another thing too. So I will keep inserting little things like that into my presentation because that's just who I am. So I will put a cough drop in my mouth so I can carry the conversation on. When the weather changes like this, it has a condition on my lung. I had lung cancer, and I lost 3/4 of my lung to lung cancer. So essentially, I'm operating on one lung and a quarter of a lung attached to my rib cage back here, just in case. And the way I talk and my energy level, people always are amazed by that, because I'm thinking to myself, man, you should see me if I had two of these lungs. So I never waste not, want not. Life is precious. So when I take the cough drop, it's not because I have corona or anything. It's just because it helps me talk and I can go through this. So let's start. So this is my PowerPoint presentation, and maybe it'll go when I go. And if it doesn't work, then we'll just have to play around with it here. So let's see. There we go. It's a good point. I want to start right here. This is my family. Now, this is important for me. I want to show you this. That little cute boy up here, that's me. That's me. And I was about 3 years old at the time, based on the date of that picture. And then that's my brother Michael, and my sister Tracy, and my brother Daryl, and me. Again, we look like the earlier version of Gladys Knight and the Pips. And then this is an important piece when you start talking about trash and treasure. But this will also give you an idea about the paths people take. How we diverge, even though we may come from the same blood, have the same DNA. It's amazing what happens to us when we take different paths based on choices. And I will still assert to this very day that so much of who we are and what we ultimately become is because of a single choice we've made that becomes a trajectory on everything else we do in life. So this is my mother at the bottom. Her name is Gloria. My father, Jimmy, I'm named after him, and he was named after his father. And those are my parents, and my parents married when they were young. My father was 17, my mother was 16, which wasn't uncommon back then in the Black community. But it's an interesting story because my father was my grandmother, who you see in the bottom right hand. They were born in West Blockton, Alabama, and she was a single mom and decided to pursue, like a lot of Blacks in the South did, her dreams in the North. So she followed her parents up here to Detroit. And long story short, she started working, brought my dad up here with her, the only son she had, the only child she had. And so he went to school in Detroit public schools. Now, what was interesting about that was during the time long before Motown was formed, but all the Motown people were there. They were just singing on street corners, and my dad was one of those people. And a small little interesting tidbit in our family history is he was one of Smokey Robinson's best friends. So he sang bass with Smokey Robinson before there were miracles. And my grandmother, who was an aspiring person, she's just one of those people who just constantly work, was learning the trades of mortuary science at a Black funeral home director, and had an opportunity to move to Flint. And she did, because he was going to fund her funeral home in Flint. So she took my dad with her. And well, long story short, My dad winds up in Flint. Smokey Robinson stays in Detroit. And they weren't just singing on street corners anymore. He became very rich and famous. I don't know if my dad ever forgot that. And that's a darker part of our story, too. So I was born, my mother, with my mother and father, and my dad and my mom. I don't know what kind of marriage they had, because by the time I was 6 years old and my brothers and my sister had been born, I don't ever remember my mother and father being together. I don't have a childhood memory of my mother and father and us kids, as beautiful as that picture looks up there. That was an Easter picture at my grandmother's home. I don't ever remember us sitting around a table having a conversation. I don't ever remember that. I just remember my father picking us up and taking us over to his house, and we'd hang over there for a little bit and he'd take us back. My mother and father were alcoholics. I think my father became an alcoholic primarily because he drank, well, his ambitions. The more popular, the greater the success of Smokey. I think he at that point felt failure. He could never seem to hold a job, even though the fact that he had 4 kids. My mother never worked a day in her life, ever. My mother never got up and went to work. So as we were born, needless to say, so became the advent of the Great Society by Lyndon LBJ, President Johnson. And so dependency became a huge issue, obviously, in Black communities where traditionally we were aspiring people. There was a dependency. Now, this is going to sound political, and you can park yourself any political corner you want to, but I won't say anything that is untrue. Now, what's happened from that is a whole nother argument. But initially, that is exactly what happened, that the welfare system, which was initially called Aid to Dependent Children, mind you, was not supposed to take people out of the workplace. It was supposed to just aid dependent children to help lift folks up into the middle class. It didn't work that way. The way it worked was that mothers were rewarded. They were rewarded with fathers not being in the home. That's a pause. They were rewarded with fathers not being in the home. So for every single mom, they not only got money for us, but they also got money because my dad was gone. You can imagine a monetary incentive for not having the dad in the home. So my dad lived by himself. He was a great chef, mind you, but he primarily stayed away. And it was really interesting to us because we were always taught to be afraid of white people. And the reason we were afraid of white people was because anybody who came into the projects, and we lived in the projects, if they came into the projects, they were either social workers or police officers. And if they were social workers, they were coming to make sure that there was no man in the house. So then they would punish my mother because there was a man in the house. You almost need a moment to let that sink in a little bit. So when you start talking about the projects, and there were probably, I'm thinking, about 100 families in the projects. There wasn't a single man that lived in the projects. It was just us and single moms. So that's how I grew up. And I grew up in poverty like you would not believe. Now, again, there's a segue to this later with my grandmother, who became very, very wealthy in Flint. So I lived in two different worlds. I would live in the projects, but I would live 2 miles away from a grandmother, Irene Greene, in the bottom right, who was aspiring. She was the first Black woman business owner in Flint. And she was just pounding out the success, carving her own success into Flint. She became an incredible power broker. She was, as a matter of fact, and you'll see a picture right after this one that'll show that, but she was the go-to. Now, my grandmother comes from West Blockton, Alabama. However, my grandmother spoke precise English. I mean, she spoke the English language better than anybody you would ever want. Now, that's an interesting dichotomy, too, when it came to us, because we grew up in the projects where there was broken English. There was Ebonics at the time. There was all this kind of crazy stuff. But my grandmother, when we would go visit her, she would literally pop you in the mouth if you spoke broken English, if you spoke in Ebonics. So I learned very early. We always laughed and called it being bilingual, because I could speak ghetto and I could speak English. And if you were in the projects, that's exactly what you didn't want to do. You didn't want to speak English because then you'd be teased with talking white. And that was a big thing when I grew up, talking white. You didn't want to talk white. You wanted to talk black. To this day, I still don't know what the hell that means. But back then, it would cost you to get into a fight. So my grandmother would reward us by learning to speak proper English. And so, we went home, we would say something to the projects, but over my grandmother's house, it was something. And she always taught us this little lesson that my brothers and I still laugh about to this day. So my grandmother says, when she would ask for ice cream. So we put my brother up, the one in the middle, Daryl, to ask for ice cream. So he goes up to grandmother and he says, "Grandmother, can I have some ice cream?" She goes, "Excuse me?" He goes, "Grandmother, can I have some ice cream?" She goes, "It's grandmother, may I have some ice cream?" So my brother regroups. He goes, "Grandmother, may I have some ice cream?" And my grandmother says, "It's may I have some ice cream, please?" So my brother says, "Grandmother, may I have some ice cream, please?" And my grandmother says, "No, you may not." Well, that became a running joke for us the entire time. We would go back and say that, "Oh, no, you may not." But her point was we hadn't had dinner yet. So despite the fact that she was giving you a lesson, she wasn't giving you ice cream either. So my grandmother, again, just an amazing entrepreneur, started out. And that's one of the reasons I learned about entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurialism, because I learned subsequently that my grandmother was pushed out of Detroit by the guy she worked for at the funeral home because he didn't want her to be his biggest competitor. And he knew, based on her strengths, her personality, that he would ultimately lose business because of her. So that's why he funded her, provided she go to Flint. Made perfect sense. So there's no top when somebody owns a funeral home. She was never going to own the funeral home. He did. So she was going to own a funeral home one way or the other. So that took her to Flint, and there you go. There's my grandmother in Flint, just kicking butt as an entrepreneur. Who did she want to be her first employee? My dad. My dad just never got that kind of work ethic. And we were taught, my mother just resented my grandmother because my mother wanted my grandmother to basically fund her. To do what? Well, that was never clear, but my mother would almost ingrain in us to hate my grandmother. So you can imagine that. We were supposed to hate my grandmother because she wouldn't take care of us. Well, that was my mother's job. And my grandmother was the first principled person I ever met. I never knew what principle, values, and those kind of things meant until much later in life when I would talk to my grandmother and ask her questions about why and how. But my grandmother would have set my mother and my father up for life if they worked, if they earned it. You can imagine how my grandmother felt. She was embracing this American dream. Now, you remember, this is in the 50s and 60s. This is not commonplace for a black woman, a black single woman to do. My grandmother never let that be a barrier for her. That was an incentive for her. That was a motivation for her. Never, please. That was not in her vocabulary, certainly not in her attitude. Whatever was there got pushed out of the way. If it wasn't Irene Greene's way, it was no way at all. So she continued to persevere. Well, there was no way in God's green earth she was going to take care of somebody who didn't. So they continued to drink. My mother was a violent alcoholic too. And even when I became 14 years of age, my mother gave up her parental rights to us. And we wound up being taken in by my grams and my big dad. Now that goes to another story. So my big dad at the top of this picture, his name is James T. Steffens. Nobody ever knew that. I don't even remember if I ever knew his real name until he died. Well, I kind of knew, but we always called him Big Dad. We called him Big Dad. Why? Because he was just huge. Don't let this picture fool you. He was massive, and everybody was just intimidated by him, but he had a heart of gold. But there was also something else about Big Dad, too, that people knew. He was a fierce entrepreneur, very independent. incredibly independent. Now, this is my mother's father. Now, think about this dynamic in this picture. Here's my father's mother. She is an incredible entrepreneur. Here's my mother's father. He is an incredible entrepreneur, and neither one of them worked. Neither one of them had the work ethic of, I don't even know what I would use as an example. They just never worked. My grandfather owned one single truck. He'd call it James T. Steffens Trucking, which gave you the impression that there were more trucks. There wasn't. There was one truck, his, a big, giant red dump truck. And every single day, Monday through Friday, he'd go to Detroit. Excuse me, we lived in Flint. He would go to Detroit and he would haul scrap iron. He would haul iron, metals, you name it, until that truck was full. He'd go to the dump yard, sell that scrap metal, and come home to a little cot that he lived in above this store in Detroit because he didn't want to waste a moment. He only came home on the weekend. That was it. Monday through Friday, he stayed in Detroit, hustling morning, noon, and night. So whether it was plumbing, carpentry, you name it, my big dad did it. He did everything. And on Friday, he'd come in with a wad of money, cash, like this, cash. And he'd go to the bank on Saturday and deposit it. And we'd go fishing or do whatever whatever he wanted to do, or watch movies. He was a huge Errol Flynn fan, which I became a huge Errol Flynn fan. If you haven't seen an Errol Flynn movie, you need to go see it. That's swashbuckling, needless to say. But he was amazing. He inspired me so. He was just, again, massive. And he would come home and he'd bring these huge iron pieces home, and he'd pay us if you could lift it. There was one time the three of us were trying to lift this thing up, and we couldn't do it. So he comes down, picks it up with one hand, and throws it in the back of the dump truck. And we just kind of look. We're like 10 or 11 years old. We're just looking at him like he's Superman. And in many ways he was. But these are two people, my big dad and my grandmother. And I say that because I had a Grams, but a grandmother. She didn't want to be Granny, Grams. She was grandmother. And she'd roll her R's too. And if I didn't have a cough drop, I could mock her. But I don't want to spit that out. So my big dad was, as a trucker, he was trying to, or he loved his independence. However, the Teamsters Union wanted him to be in the union. And when the Teamsters Union wants you to be in the union, they don't ask, well, they ask you nice once, and then they don't. Then they intimidate. And they tried to intimidate him. He was beaten by the cops. He had his truck defaced. He had materials poured down his gas tank. They were constantly trying to get him to join the trade union. He wouldn't do it. He would never do it. He came home one day just bloody, and he fought off, he said, about 10 or 12 union guys. And that's when I learned the phrase. I always think he did it because I didn't hear it before that. I've heard it a lot after that. But when my Grams said to him, "Oh my God, what happened to you?" And he said, "Well, don't worry about me. You should see what happened to the other guys." Because I guess he had a lead pipe, and he went to town on those guys too. So he might have got bloody, but I do know this: he never came home bloodied again. So it must have been whatever happened. He certainly left a lesson that he was not going to be intimidated, nor was he going to give up his fierce independence. So my grandmother, my big dad became me. And that's an important distinction for every single one of us to make. And when I talk to people, young people in particular, I do a lot of work with juvenile homes, for example. I do a lot of work with women of abuse centers. I'm on those board of directors as well. There's nothing accidental about me and my volunteerism. I'm intentional and purposeful when I volunteer. There's an empathy that I have that my capitalism, my embracement of free enterprise has allowed me access to, because quite frankly, that's really where the seats of power are. It's people who have attained something, accumulated something. And I always say that is the benchmark for character. My grandfather taught me something I'll teach you, and maybe you've heard it too in different ways. But my grandfather used to always say, you know what, everybody in the world is philanthropic when they don't have anything. And I'm thinking to myself, philanthropic. Of course, he explained what that meant. But he's right. He was right then. Everybody feels like they'd feed the world. But he gave us this lesson. He used to always say, we'd sit around, he'd have his shirt off. He's just this huge man. And he'd always say, give us these little parables. And he was talking about being hungry. And there was a TV show on and somebody was hungry. And he stopped, literally stopped, got up, turned the TV off. And he says, you know what? Let me tell you what somebody hungry doesn't want. What they don't want is your sympathy. They don't want your sympathy. He would teach us this at a young age. What they want is a sandwich. They don't want your sympathy. They want a sandwich. The only way you do that is to accumulate. You have to accumulate something in order to give. Other than that, you're just part of the problem. You're just another hungry person that the world has to feed. Now, when you accumulate something and somebody asks you for something, if a hungry man asks you for a sandwich and you have two, that becomes the definition of your character. Do you tell him, hey, go get your own sandwich? That's probably not the best character. You might say you have it. It certainly doesn't make you philanthropic. If, on the other hand, you give that person a sandwich, that's great character. First of all, you're not concerned about getting another sandwich because you already earned two and you know how to get two more sandwiches. And I never forgot that about accumulation, because that's really what the free enterprise system is all about. It's about accumulation. It's not about retention or retaining. I don't know anybody I've ever met. I've been fortunate to meet some incredible entrepreneurs, some incredible people who embrace free enterprise. I've never met one who kept what they had. They always gave away what they had only because they knew they'd get more. And they became more of this spigot, if anything. They never just became a dam. It never became this wall of it's all mine, it's all mine. I'm sure there are people out there like that. I'm sure there are. I just haven't met them. One of my best friends in the world who is a contributor out to Northwood is Dick Garber. I love Dick Garber, not because it's Dick Garber, the Garber automotive guy, but because of Dick Garber. Who he is as a man is amazing to me. He's a man who's accumulated. He's gotten things, but what he gives away is immeasurable. And that's the stuff you see. There's so much stuff that he does you do not see that is just phenomenal. I always wanted to be one of those kind of people. You got to remember, look at those pictures again, where I come from. I still to this very day feel humbled by the idea I'm in a room with people like Dick Garber. I'm able to serve people or serve with people or serve on boards or serve. And I keep using the word serve time and time again because somehow somebody thought I'm relevant enough to matter. And coming from that picture, coming from these pictures here, means the world to me. Now, what's interesting about this picture here is my sister. And I'll talk about her a little bit as we go through here, because everything I do in life is dedicated to my sister. I always feel like even though I lost 3/4 of a lung, I had 2 more to give anyway, because my sister was murdered. My sister was murdered when she was 17 years of age. Because when I mentioned earlier, we were given up by my mother. My mother kept my sister. The 3 boys went to live with my grams and my big dad, and they saved our lives. I mean, literally saved our lives. I can't imagine what our life would be like had we stayed in the projects or stayed with my mother without that kind of guidance. And so we lost so many of our friends to drugs or prison, murder, you name it. It's a project story. I don't have to tell you. You can go read about it or you see it on TV all the time. And there's this obsession with black pain. It just drives me crazy. But that's another topic that Dale might ask me to come back and talk about. But I believe in healing. And my sister she ultimately wound up being abused by my mother's string of boyfriends, and then ultimately wound up in prostitution. She got pregnant. She was going to give up that side of her life, and her pimp wouldn't let her, so he killed her. He ran her up and down. He ran her over with a car. And by then, I had gotten out of Flint, and I was at Eastern Michigan University. And so there's nothing worse than a call you get when somebody says, hey, you need to come home, and they won't tell you why. And then you get home, you have to identify your sister's body, which is barely able to be identifiable. And I know this might not be part of the story, that you suspected or expected, but it's my story. It's an important piece. I can't have those accolades read up front without you understanding the equity, personal equity that went into those accolades. So if he had read all of it, he would have seen a lot of Underground Railroad, shelter house, child and neglect associations, big brothers, big sisters, those kinds of things. Now, by me telling you what happened to my sister and my upbringing, I start to make sense. So when people say, "Oh my God, I don't know how you do all of what you do," of course you don't, unless you know who I am and where I come from, unless you know my big dad who taught me about character and what having an extra sandwich means, unless you know about my grandmother who taught me how to navigate in a white world by speaking English, who taught me what perseverance, who taught me that nothing is a barrier. Nothing. I never saw my grandmother with a barrier. She didn't think they existed. And that was an important piece. And that segues to this. What does freedom mean? So we talk about free enterprise. We talk about the freedom. You hear it all the time. It's become almost a cliche. I don't even know if people know what freedom means anymore because they take it for granted. Up in the upper right corner, that's my grandmother. You see her again. That face you look at might look familiar to you, but that's Governor George Romney. That's Mitt's father. He was the governor of Michigan, for those of you who are age appropriate. He was a Republican. My grandmother became a Republican primarily, even though most blacks were Republican prior to the 1900s. By about 1940, most blacks had become Democrats. My grandmother refused to be a Democrat, only because there was a sense of independence, a sense of conservatism, a sense of leave me alone that my grandmother embraced that the Republican Party had. That is not to say that she didn't value or respect Democrats, because she did. That wasn't the point. It was her politics were personal for her, as mine are. And she embraced that, and she met and she became a kingmaker. She was one of the chief political strategists for Governor Romney. She ran his political affairs office in Flint while still running her own business, the Greene Home for Funerals. But she also knew that politics was access. Politics was power. Politics was about policy. Down here, you'll see a man she married in the left corner here. That's Martin Luther King. Right over his shoulder is Leo Greene, a man that my grandmother married after she had become successful. She married Leo Greene and brought him into her business, not the other way around, like some people suspect or think, because we tend to think it's male and then female. Not my grandmother. She brought him in. You can see this march. That's Romney there. That's my grandmother over his shoulder with those cat glasses on and a hat on. It was blazing hot that day on June 23rd, 1963, when they marched for freedom. Freedom, again, was different from my grandmother. Freedom for my grandmother meant, leave me alone. I'll do it. There was a show at the time. It was a talk show. For you who might be age appropriate now, you think Jimmy Fallon. In my generation, it was Dick Cavett and Johnny Carson. Well, Dick Cavett had a very famous black author on, James Baldwin. And James Baldwin was posed a question by Dick Cavett because there was this litany of grievances that black folks had, and many of them justifiable too. But Dick Cavett said, "Well, I don't understand. I don't understand this African American thing, or at the time the Negro issue. I don't understand what that means." And Dick Cavett said, "So, Mr. Baldwin, what do you want from white people?" And James Baldwin said something that stuck with me. It resonated with my grandmother big time. His response was, "We don't want anything from you. We just want you to leave us alone." That was powerful, because at the time, while people had grievances, people also had freedoms that they had never had before. And his point was, if you leave me alone, I'll exercise my freedoms. Well, my grandmother, years before that, had already exercised hers. Her freedom was oxygen and energy. Those were the only ingredients my grandmother needed. I'm breathing and I'm getting up. I'm getting up. When I asked my grandmother years later about how you do what, I forgot what the question was. And my grandmother said something that I teach my kids to this day. Just get up. I mean, I know you can read a book with 300 pages in it, all these motivational pieces, but there are no guarantees, no scripture to your life. None. There's no script written to your life. Only the one you write every single day. And that page starts with you just getting up. And my grandmother taught me that lesson. I've always gotten up. I've never been unemployed a day in my life, which is ironic because my parents didn't work, as I said earlier. But that goes to show you something, that we can be our parents' children. We can even be their DNA, but we don't have to be their choices. My grandmother, my grandfather, Big Dad, they were examples of that. They came from dire straits. They came as bad as it was for my mother and father, so they thought. Imagine what my grandmother came through. Imagine what Big Dad came through. They came through in the 20s. It was really bad then. I mean, hell, they were still burning crosses on public lawns. It was, I mean, people were both brazen and blazing enough to walk around with KKK hood and the whole uniform on. So you can imagine my grandmother is thinking, this isn't bad. So she exercised that oxygen and that energy to advance herself. Freedom to her meant get out of my way. Freedom to James Baldwin meant get out of my way. I'll figure out the rest of it. That's what freedom really was to them. And they became, again, my personal heroes long before a lot of other people did. But they also inspired me. They inspired me to do something. Now, I'm going to stop there. Do something. They didn't say what. They didn't say what. I'd already had the oxygen and energy of my grandmother. I'd already had the character from my big dad. So the rest of it, they never wanted to script that for me. They wanted me to script my life. That's that just get up. And so I've written a page every single day. That's my script. That's my life. It has nothing to do with my mother and father. And as I got older, I forgave my mother and father for what they did or didn't do because they gave me life. They gave me life. So what more did I need? Yeah, you can say, well, guidance, tutoring, mentoring, direction. I don't know, but that's passé. My future is much stronger than my past, always has been. And so I learned what not to do, what not to be. I've never had alcohol in my life. I've never done drugs, smoked weed. I've never done any of those things only because I had a freedom. I had a freedom to choose. I didn't have to do that. I didn't want to be my mother and father. I wanted to be more my grandmother and my big dad. I chose what freedom meant to me. And the freedom for me meant free enterprise. It meant, wow, I want to embrace this because I don't know anything greater than capitalism that has uplifted my people. When I say my people, I'm talking about my family members in particular, not an entire race of people. That's too much heavy lifting. I've always felt like, the better you, that bleeds out. I was at a symposium one year, and the symposium I was at did something for me that, again, changed my life. It was a symposium where we were supposed to fix the world's problems, and they brought 400 of us together, and they were from all over the world. I was astonished that I was picked, but I was picked by Dow Chemical, who was Dow Chemical at the time, not just Dow, to represent the region on workforce development, primarily because I work with contractors. We've done a lot of work with Dow. We maintain that plant from a maintenance standpoint. We do a lot of good work. And so I was intimidated. I'm not often intimidated. My grandmother taught me that all those people, none of those people are better than you. They all got problems. And besides, you belong in a room more than they do because you had to work to get in there, where most of them got there by their names. So she always made sure I humbled other people. But I have to admit, I was intimidated when people started reading off names like Dr. this and Dr. that and CEO this and CEO that. But at the same time, I knew I had something to contribute. So they split us up, 400 of us. They split us up into 4 groups. So there was one group here with workforce, one group with poverty, one group with energy, and the other group with water. And so we were supposed to fix these problems that the world was having. We never saw the other three groups. So the first day, the idea was talk about the problem. Identify. Don't moan and groan. Identify what the issue is. So we did. The second day, bitch about it. Complain, wax it over, time and time again. You can talk about it all you want to. Third day, fix it. So we fixed it. The fourth day, we got back together for breakfast and we finally saw the other three groups. And we're in this massive auditorium in Washington, D.C. The room goes dark. The moderator comes out on stage and the moderator says, well, I got good news, bad news, and good news. He goes, first of all, good news, you fixed the world's problems. And there was this big roar, 400 of us. We were exhausted because we stayed up. We had this great energy going. We'd get back together and talk in little corners and coffee this and coffee that. We're having a great time. And so ultimately, we get back and then this flash comes on and there's a screen and it lists out our solutions. And then the second screen, the third screen, the fourth screen. So everybody's solutions are out there. And there's this, again, another big roar. It was amazing. I still feel the chills talking about it. And then the room went dark again. And the moderator says, I've got bad news. I said I had bad news. And we kind of went, thud. And he says, the world's too big to fix. Good idea, bad practice. You can't fix the world. Well, needless to say, that's when I felt like I was really from Flint because I was about ready to cuss him out. So he says, hold on, because you can hear this slow murmur like, what? So he says, I said good news, bad news, good news. Here's the good news. And the screens lit up again. They lit up again. And I couldn't tell what just numbers. And I'm like, what is that? So finally, I recognized something. And it was my zip code. I recognized my zip code. I'm like, oh my God. And it hit me. And it hit everybody. I guess at that point, they figured out we were as smart as they thought we were because people got it. It was the world's too big to fix, but not your zip code, that you can take the best ideas from around the world and just take them home. Like go home and see what's applicable, see what you can do now. Well, that became a lesson for me as an individual, which was the bigger lesson there. Be a better you. Take all the things that work, and some things just don't apply. That's okay. Shelve them for now. But at the end of the day, just be a better you. Embrace the kind of things that make your world better. A better you bleeding out makes everybody around you better. That became another freedom for me. That became a spirit for me for entrepreneurialism. That became my courage. I always felt like, so what? Failure coming from where I come from, the projects, are you kidding? Like this, like a business model doesn't work out. So what? I come from hell. I come from trash. Who cares? I have made it to a point where now I have the embracement of a real freedom, the freedom that my grandmother, my grandfather, they really marched for. The freedom that my big dad got his butt kicked for, really? And I should have what, a issue, a problem, a barrier? How dare I? Because that's what freedom really meant. It meant the aggression to embrace capitalism, entrepreneurialism, free enterprise, whatever you want to call it, the ability to be able to dictate your own pathway. And there's an interesting piece that comes with that too, which again I'll talk about, and that's the entrepreneurialism. So I decided I was going to start out by doing something for me, for everybody else. It really started out, and I've had a number of leadership groups, but during the 60s, there was this phrase, and I think it was Stokely Carmichael who said it. And there were two schools of thought at the time in the 60s when I was a teenager that you had to embrace. So there was a Martin Luther King embrace, which was more the passive, peaceful. And then there was the Black Panther / Malcolm X. I was more that. I didn't want to, and I think there's room for both. There's room for a passive, peaceful way, but then sometimes you just got to do things a little bit different. I have since learned, and you will learn this too, if you're college students, you will learn that you're one of two types of people when you embrace leadership. when you embrace your freedom to pick and choose which you'll be. You'll either be a peacekeeper or a peacemaker. And you should understand the difference between them because they sound so much alike. They are not alike at all. Because a peacekeeper says, everything's fine. Everything's okay. We got this. Keep the peace down. Let's not disrupt things. I'm not that kind of person. I'm a peacemaker. A peacemaker blows things up. Things that don't work, they throw them out. They're not afraid of offense. They're not afraid of hurt feelings. They're not afraid of those kind of things because they know they are necessary to get to a place where, believe it or not, the peacekeeper can come in because things are where they should be, where they're supposed to be, until they get so complacent that they have no relevancy, no efficiency, no effectiveness, no value. Then you got to blow them up again. That's what I like to do. I like to blow things up that just don't work anymore. That's why I love entrepreneurialism. It's an opportunity to take all of this and do something with it. I still believe to this very day that the very main issue that confronts Black America to this day is the fact that it has too little entrepreneurial enterprise. It has too much dependency on governmental, public, you name it, and not enough in private entrepreneurialism And this is not an indictment. It is not a criticism. It is not an insult. It is a choice. Remember that. I'm talking purely choice, the choices that people make. And I still suggest that if somebody is putting food on their table legally and ethically, more power to them. God bless them. But I still don't believe it solves that zip code thing. I still don't believe that at all. I believe that entrepreneurialism, free enterprise is a means to progress many of the ailments, many of the things, many of the grievances that afflict Black America to this day. And I think it affects rural America too, for that matter, because when I look at capitalism, when I look at the things that affect Black America, well, those things affect white America and Asian America and Hispanic America, you name it. I mean, it's a pothole. I mean, that where we are right now, it's a pothole. And a pothole does not differentiate race, creed, color. It's not an LGBTQ issue. It's not a Black issue, white issue. It's a pothole. It has the same damaging effect for every single person. The only thing that fixes the pothole is fixing the pothole. And that has no color to it as well. So what I started to do was go out, talk to people. And it's interesting that I did this years ago. And my grandmother did it in the 60s too, when they were burning down places in the 60s during the riots in particular. And she always said that, I don't get that. I don't get that. But then she did, because she realized that they don't own anything. It's easy to just burn things up when you don't own them. And that again goes back to the embracement of free enterprise. It goes back to the embracement of entrepreneurialism. If you own it, you protect it. There is something in there that you will not let happen. And that's the destruction of it. You will not allow that to happen. Your community is yours. You won't burn down your community. And that's why you see in this phrase, people don't burn down what they build up. That is so very true. So what I've been trying to do is focus more on that attitude. And it is an attitude to have more Black-led employer firms, but also to create an entrepreneurialism piece too, in honor of my grandmother. My grandmother, again, as I suggested, was entrepreneurial. She was going to grow inside of a company, and by doing so, she made him richer. She made him richer by being better at what she did. And that was an important piece too for her. So she's growing, he's growing, but then there's that ceiling piece. What are you going to do with it? Well, you either find a way as a corporation or a university, or whatever that is, to embrace and retain that kind of talent, or they're going to go elsewhere. But that's good for everybody involved. Those people become job creators. My grandmother, became a job creator. She hired her own maintenance crew. She hired embalmers. She hired drivers. My grandmother became a job creator by embracing that choice, by embracing real freedom. She created it for other people. So the Center for Entrepreneurial Enterprise is designed to do that. It's mine. I've started groups before, started my own companies before. I love working for contractors, builders and contractors in particular. Why? They're the greatest entrepreneurs in the world to me. They really are, because nothing happens without them. There's no building without them. There's no Northwood University. There's no roads. There are no hospitals. My people do all that work. Even in the pandemic, when people went shut down, we only went like this. We had to get back to work. We were the first industry out. Why? Because we built all the safeguards. We built all the places for people to go back into, the schools, the hospitals, the university, you name it. We were there. We still are, because toilets still need to flush and, people still need electricity, and there were still buildings that needed to be done. People needed homes. So my folks did that. What I'm trying to do is encourage Black people who have a electrical experience, an electrical expertise. Why aren't you hanging up your own shingle? Why aren't you creating a job? Why aren't you creating jobs? There are people coming in and out of the prison system in particular who can't get hired primarily because they have a felony, or maybe they can't pass a drug test. Stop complaining about it. Be the guy or the woman who signs the front of a check, because those people rule the world. End of story. I don't care where you work, who you work for. If you're going to be a CPA, if you're going to be, whatever that is, that person who signs the front of the check has the greatest freedom in the world. They dictate the rules. They dictate the rules. We will hire these people. We won't hire those people. That is the greatest freedom you could ever imagine, this entrepreneurial thing, because now guess what? You own the choices. You get to determine who does, who doesn't. You get to determine growth. You get to determine who goes up, who goes down. You get to make those determinations. I mean, is there a greater freedom than that? To be able to put your principles, your values, the things you believe in right at the forefront? You know what? It's also a scary thing for people, which is ultimately what determines who becomes the signer of the front and who becomes the endorser in the back. And that's what free enterprise does. And that's the piece that I'm trying to really explain to a lot of people. You can look at this saying right here. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. James Baldwin again. I use quotes a lot because they reflect a history. They reflect a lot of people doing a lot of good things. And so I'll breeze through this PowerPoint because it's a little bit more than that. But I really wanted you to get a sense of what this entrepreneurial enterprise does, and more importantly, who it's designed for, and more importantly than that, where it comes from. It comes from me, and it comes from my grandmother, and it comes from my big dad. And here, Carter Woodson, who's one of my heroes and somebody who I've learned from like you would not believe, is incredible. He talks in the long run, there's not much discrimination against superior talent. It constrains men to recognize it. That is choice. That is having a talent. That is putting your mind to work. That is truly embracing what it is to be that person. So I've started doing a lot of political work. I work in politics time and time again because I recognize policy is where we necessarily have to be as a people. We have to be in places where we're talking about entrepreneurialism, free enterprise. We cannot lose this. The thing that makes us the greatest country in the world is that freedom to choose. You don't have to be Catholic here. You might have to someplace else. You don't have to be Muslim. You don't have to be Protestant. You could be an atheist here. That freedom to choose is so important. And again, that entrepreneurial spirit that I talk about comes from that choice. And that is where I think as a country, we need to start talking about more. I feel a loss of it, quite frankly. These are some statistics, again, that I talk about. If you want to lift yourself up, lift someone else up, my grandmother, my big dad, that's who they are. That's what they did. They didn't just go into a corner. They didn't just quarantine themselves. They came out. They found opportunities and ways for people to lift up. And by doing so, they lifted themselves up too. This is a statistic that just bothers me to know in the underrepresentation of Black-owned and Black women-owned businesses. I mean, look at that. It's just amazing when you see this. And I'll have this PowerPoint presentation to Northwood so that you can see this and look at some of these things and understand why we're in danger in this country if we continue to lose our sense of entrepreneurialism, if we become more public driven as employers. You're starting to see that even in this unemployment stipend that's out there. The government has become the biggest employer, and the job for the people receiving or signing the back of a check is to stay home. That is not entrepreneurial. That is not free enterprise. And that's certainly a terrible choice that people are starting to make. So this piece that they're doing, which I love Northwood doing this, is again constantly reinforcing that you can be Democrat, you can be Republican, you can be in a union. I'm not anti-union by any stretch. I hate anti-union politics. I hate anti-union. I don't like when anything is predisposed to be union only. I love a right to work state, which is simply nothing more than a question. Would you like to belong to the union? There you go. A simple question, simple choice for the employee to make. I enjoy that. I like that. I think that's what this country is made of. Here, don't sit down and wait for the opportunities to come up. Get up and make them. This is Madam C.J. Walker. She was the first Black millionaire in the country. And boy, if there was anybody that I could attribute a quote that would identify my grandmother, it would be that one right there. Because that's exactly what she did. My grandmother, that was her thing. Get up. Just get up. Every day you write your own script. The last piece that I'll talk about before I get into the Q&As are really important. These are some of the things I've done, and I'm glad that Dale brought them up earlier because, again, when you look at what I've done, I've owned and operated my own business. I've founded leadership groups. I started the Henry Marsh Institute for Public Policy because I think it's important for people to be involved in politics and public policy. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with Republicans or Democrat parties. There's something wrong with people. Parties are fine. Public policy is fine. There are people who are screwed up, not parties. So just be a better person. You'll make a better party. These are just, again, some of the things that I've done, but that's not who I am. I've done them, but it's not who I am. Who I am, I've already told you about. And then lastly, again, this is my bio. This is my real bio here. And it'll tell you all the different organizations I belong to. This is payback for my grandmother. More importantly, my grandmother and my big dad. When you look at the board of directors I've served on, I did come from trash, but what I've left behind is nothing more than treasure. I still feel that this has been the greatest experience that any one person could have ever had. I feel so blessed that I was even offered an opportunity to speak. You know, we don't determine our relevancy. Other people do. You can't walk into a room and say, hey, I'm irrelevant. You can't walk on a board and say, hey, I volunteer. There are people who knock on your door. I also recognize that one day, somebody won't knock on your door. One day you won't be offered an invitation. And I'm telling you, as young people, when people are asking you to do something, do it. What they're doing is validating your relevancy. They're giving you the first glimpse into who you are. This is one of my heroes, Henry Marsh, who was the first Black mayor in Saginaw. And that was his quote. It's never been about who you know. It's who knows you that matters most. That's how things get done. That's why it's important to be accessible. It's important to join, to volunteer. The free enterprise system allows that kind of access. These are people I've met along the way. There's Congressman Mullinar, Congressman John Lewis, who was a civil rights hero. This is a funny story about me helping Mitt Romney run for president. The Romneys and Greenes got back together again. And yes, even though people hate Nancy Pelosi, I have great respect for her. I think she's, as John Boehner said, probably the most powerful speaker that we've had in this country. She knows how to use power. And that's important too. You know, we don't have to dislike people because of their politics. We need to understand them. And that helps all of us along the way. This is Governor Whitmer. And quite frankly, I criticize her more than anybody in the world. But believe it or not, she's a friend. Good friends. We saw each other 2 weeks ago, and she even laughed and said, you know, hey, you fairly criticized. You know, I don't like it, but I never demean anybody at all. You know, again, those are choices and windows into our own personal characters. Politics don't define you. You define your politics. And it is about access. People I've met along the way, I've used these people. There's, again, there's Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey, Congressman Kildee, all these people I've met. I'll get past this here. We don't need this. This is dedicated to my sister, Tracy. Everything I do is dedicated to her because, again, my sister died at 17 years of age. How dare I let her death go in vain? How dare I not share, her oxygen, her energy, her lost dreams with the world? I have no excuses. So even though I was born into that kind of trash, my sister never escaped it. She never had the opportunity to embrace free enterprise. She never had the opportunity to truly understand what was so wonderful and great about this country. Her choices were made too late. And this is my treasure. These are my 6 kids. My 6 kids, I have 2 boys and 4 daughters. What's really funny about this story, my kids find my real story so different that it's hard for them to believe it. It's like my brothers, they believe it now. But my brothers almost have to attest to things that I tell them about my childhood. It is the greatest honor in my life that I am so removed from how I was born that my own kids don't believe it. Now let that simmer for a minute, that my own kids don't believe it. They have had a life of privilege. And for the record, I love that word. I love the word privilege. I don't believe white privilege, black privilege should be curses. I think they're blessings. Because I tell my kids all the time, if somebody says to you, you're privileged, say yes. Yes, I am. And you know why? Because if they didn't, think about the insult it means to me that I made the right choices, that I did the right things to put them on a life that they don't even believe their own father's story. How dare they not accept their privilege? Now, with that privilege comes a responsibility. You don't have excuses not to be better. You don't have excuses because you have a head start. And where I had 2 sandwiches, you better have 4. Where I've contributed to the community, coming from where I've come from, you better contribute more. They were born and left the house with a baggage of goodies. Not trash, but treasures. Not trash, but treasures. So I encourage any of you who've had trials and tribulations or difficulties, or before you embrace the world, or maybe you are the privileged ones, embrace those things and accept this country's opportunities. Accept this country's incredible, incredible jewels to make your own treasures. To make your own treasures. So I appreciate you having me on. I'm going to turn it over for questions if Dale has any. I didn't go past my time, which I can do this forever. I had to skip through a lot. So I appreciate you. I am so humbled and honored that you allowed me to be your guest. My grandmother and my big dad would just be smiling like crazy, and he'd probably say something like, "Boy, you ain't nothing anyway. Go get out of here." My grandmother, on the other hand, would be so proud because I'm sad that they never got to see this, but they never got to see this here on Earth, but I'm sure they watch it down. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Jimmy, for sharing that inspiring story. And there's a lot of information there. You're right, and I'm sure that you could expound on, especially on a lot of those slides where the information went by so quickly. But while we're waiting for people to put your questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen,
yes,
I'm going to ask you to begin with. First of all, it is a huge concern that there's not more entrepreneurship in the Black community. In fact, yeah. I think we're seeing declining entrepreneurship really among young people generally.
Yeah.
But I wonder, what are the obstacles to entrepreneurship? You've had enough experience that you've seen changes in public policy, you've seen changes in education, you've seen changes in culture. I guess I'm getting at, is it becoming harder? Is it becoming easier? Is it a change in the mindset or the culture? And then what are the specific obstacles to Black entrepreneurship? Mm-hmm. And what can we do about those?
Yeah, that again I don't think it's as complex as most people would prefer. I think when you make it big, and it goes back to the example I was trying to make about if it's huge, it's a problem. But I look at Saginaw, for example. I look at Saginaw. has a black population that, quite frankly, is underserved by a lack of entrepreneurial education. We learn math, we learn everything when somebody plants the idea in our head. My question is, who's planting the idea? It's not in the school districts. We don't have a lot of black owned businesses in Saginaw. So where would a young ninth or 10th grader even get the idea of being entrepreneurial? It has to be intentional. Here's my, right now, the big thing is diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? It's measurable. People say, well, we only have this many white people, so we need this many black people. Okay, so you can start counting. Why aren't we doing that for entrepreneurialism? Why aren't we simply making it an intention? And more importantly, calling ourselves on the carpet, and maybe we're not doing enough. But here's the other thing. The match side of that is on the receiving end. You can say it, but if nobody wants to do it, then you just have a complete disconnect. So black folks have this responsibility to accept access, to get outside the enclaves of what you think you know, or even in your own community, and embrace the idea that these things are out there. They really are. It's a mindset in many different ways. We want to make it seem so big, so huge. It really isn't. It is a mindset. And I'm simply suggesting that's where the Center for Entrepreneurial Enterprise is designed to do. When I talk about skilled tradespeople and the electrician, the carpenter, the HVAC, the welder guy, I'm going to say, how come you're not hanging your own shingle out? And they're going to say, well, I don't have. Yes, you do. Small Business Administration. Right now, black is in. Let's face it. I mean, you have an administration, a Democratic administration. Black people should be pounding on their doors. They're their biggest voting bloc. There's 90%. Where's the return on investment? I always say voting is an investment. I expect something in return. And so knocking on doors, simply saying, hey, Saginaw needs to be a more viable place for black entrepreneurialism, is an expectation of an investment. That investment was a vote. Where is it? We need to pose the questions, and more importantly, we need to hold people accountable for it. But you can lead people to the water, but again, somebody's got to drink. So there are two complex issues here. One is not complex, two simple issues. One is a demand and an expectation and measurable, and then a desire. You put those together, you'll change the dynamics of entrepreneurialism.
Jimmy, I think in your own case, you were exposed to some role models. You had some mentoring from your grandparents. And I think that in the lives of many entrepreneurs is a common experience.
Oh, yeah.
And is it just the fact that this is a problem that reinforces itself? Nobody's starting businesses, so nobody has those role models. Nobody gets that mentorship. How is your center exposing kids to?
We are. I'll tell you, it's something interesting too. You can keep your eye on this. I embraced a state representative. His name is Tommy Brann, and Tommy Brann is on the west side of the state. It's Brann. He has since introduced a bill to bring, I know it sounds crazy, free enterprise into the school district as an approved curriculum. It's passed the House committee. It'll wind up in the House. And then ultimately, we're going to nurse that thing through to the Senate. And hopefully, we'll have the governor sign it. There are some bipartisan efforts out there, despite the adverse relationship between Republicans and Democrats. There are some things they're working on. So far, it looks like this is going to happen. We're not going to fix the world in a day. But I can tell you what, if we can introduce this into school districts in particular, especially in urban centers, we'll start to get there by first planting an idea. Oh, my God, all things are possible in this country.
Yeah. I'm going to read some of the questions that have come in from the people listening online. So I'm going to start with Jen's question. I think it's a good one. Have you considered running for political office?
I could never I would never have a party endorse me. I'm very strong. I'm probably more libertarian than anything because I have very strong social views. I sit on the Great Lakes Bay Pride Board, so I have strong LGBTQ alliances. That doesn't fit well on the right side. you heard my free enterprise and my business model. That fits very nicely on the right side, not so nice on the left side. So I don't think any of the parties would actually endorse me.
Well, I don't know. You seem to have a way of bridging the gap. So,
Well,
think about it.
I think politics is buffet. I think most people, quite frankly, they like a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Nope, I don't want that on my plate. I do want that on. I really do believe I work in politics all day, every day. It's more than 70% of the populace, but money controls that other 30%, 15. They have the money and the loud voices, so the 70% just typically shows up in November and votes for the loudest voice.
Hmm. I'm getting some great feedback. Not questions, but
Yeah.
thank you for your presentation. It was an inspiration. Thank you for your perspective. I love to hear your perspective on privilege. Now, I have to say, when I hear the word privilege, I hear it used divisively. I think
I
when you apply it to children, your own kids, I don't think that's your message. Maybe you could comment a little bit on that.
No, I think I don't care who it's attributed to. You can be 40, 50, 60, or 15. The word privilege means that somehow, somewhere, somebody in your life has made a good choice. That you started out ahead of everybody else is not an insult. We should demand more from that person because they didn't have the handicaps, they didn't have the poverty, they didn't have the sort of things that other people had as barriers or obstacles or racisms or prejudices, whatever we want to use as a reason why people aren't here. Guess what? Your mom, your dad, your grandparents, they did something noble. They did something that changed the fortune of your family. You are privileged. God bless you. Now, do something with it. Dude, now I don't want to bash you with it. You're the person with the access. You're the person with the power. You're the person with the political sway. You're the person with the other sandwich. Do something with it. Let's not bash and send you in a closet and make you feel embarrassed about it. Not to mention the insult you just gave an entire ancestry of your family. Because they did something right. Are you kidding? You know what the insult that means? That they didn't do this or no, I would never insult my grandmother or my big dad that way. No, do more with it. That's what we should be doing with privilege. Do more with it. Let's demand more. Let's not embarrass more, insult more. No, let's demand more. You got a head start, damn it. Good. And go back and thank your grandma or parents for doing something right. I'm
Right.
sorry. I don't buy into that privilege thing. I think it's terrible. I really do. I think it's the wrong message. If it's asking people or expecting something, that's one thing. But to insult people with it or make them ashamed of it, I think that's a terrible message in this country. And that might be part of the problem we're having in this country, too. We're ashamed of the wrong things.
Well, I think when you defined freedom for us, and when you talk about some other words, there are words that in themselves are quite universal and universally admired and useful. But sometimes we weaponize language. Uh, we try to use these words in a way that makes us look better or worse. And I think that's part of the problem.
Ronald Reagan, who was not the great communicator that people think he was a simple communicator. Well, I went to a rally of his in Ann Arbor, and the question came from the NAACP, and they said, "Hey, Mr. President," or he was running for president, and they wanted to know what he would do for African Americans. And he said, "Well, I'm not going to do anything for African Americans that I'm not doing for other Americans." I became a Republican that day.
I'm not sure what would happen if a president said something like that today.
They'd
I
be, yeah, they'd be vilified. They'd be woke. They'd be woked on. I,
canceled.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. I know. I say some of the wrong things all the time, but then again, here's what I don't do is I've reached a point in my life where I am not going to put my character on somebody else's scale to weigh.
mhm. I am fascinated by the fact that you named the Black Panthers as a group you were particularly attracted to.
Yeah, I was
There
like
is,
I was Black, yeah.
There's a kind of peaceful uh, movement. You mentioned peacemakers, peacekeepers. I thought that was a really great distinction. But I want to clarify something so I don't misunderstand you. Peacemakers can use violence to make peace. Is that what you're implying there?
Oh, no, when I say
Sometimes
disrupt,
people.
and I don't necessarily mean literally blow up things. I mean, I typically mean from a peacemaker standpoint, you walk into an organization that isn't what it should be, or necessarily it's short of where it could be, and should, like influence, for example. So being able to blow up an organizational chart, the way things, well, that's not my job. Well, it is now. Those kind
Yeah,
of things talk about the disruption, and peacemakers are disruptors,
right.
and necessarily so. It doesn't work. Well, that's the way we've always done it. That becomes the difference between a peacekeeper and a peacemaker. But okay, well, if that's the way we've always done it, okay, let's just keep doing it that way. Or, well, I don't want to do it that way. And so you completely disrupt it to put it back down to a place where ultimately you are where you're supposed to be. So yeah, that distinction is necessary. But no, I don't want anybody out there thinking we're some domestic terrorists here. Oh,
um,
literally blow it up. No.
yeah, I wanted to give you a chance to clarify that. I
Yeah.
knew you would.
I'm glad you said that. That's all I need to get hit here the paper. Or Mr. Greene said.
Yeah.
So I wear my hat, for your listening audience. My hat I've worn. I wear it every day. Nobody recognizes me without this hat on. But this hat is really my thing. It's ABC, and we are free enterprise people. I wear it every day as sort of a beacon. I wear it every day because I'm incredibly proud of it, even though it's antagonistic toward people who don't like free enterprise and open choice. Maybe that's my way of kind of putting my own zip code out there too with this hat.
Well, we appreciate uh, putting yourself out here, and we appreciate the message you shared with us today. And I want to thank you once again for being here. It's been our pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dale. Love it. And if I will send you the enterprise PowerPoint, so for anybody who wants to see it, they can. I think I did. I sent it out to you. So
I've got it, and I will share that.
please feel free to share it. So thank you guys, and have a blessed Sunday and free enterprise life.
Thank you.